For more on this coup attempt, I'm joined now by Peter Vincent. He's here on the set with us. He's a counterterrorism and law enforcement expert who works at Borderpol. That's a nonprofit focusing on international law enforcement. Obviously, no love lost between Erdogan and the folks there in Syria, but also he has problems in his own country. I know you've traveled a lot in Turkey, as our guest was pointing out. 45% very much not in his camp. This is a polarizing figure. Where does this country go after this?
It's been an absolutely extraordinary night. And as you pointed out, I've spent a lot of time in Turkey, both in Ankara, the capital, and in Istanbul, and I could not have imagined this. It truly has been bizarre. You know, we call it a coup d'etat. It's looking more and more like a coup de colonels, sort of lower ranked or certain factions of the Turkish armed forces. The president is not very popular. And that has led certain folks more cynical than I to suggest that maybe this was somehow fabricated in some way to allow him to essentially consolidate greater power. And that's of great concern. From a counterterrorism perspective, of course, the global concern is whether or not ISIL will take advantage of this chaos, whether in the short term or the long term. And I can tell you that the United States government is quite concerned about that.
And ISIS, interestingly enough, because you and I have talked about this, that's never been Erdogan's main focus. When it's targeting terrorism, he doesn't see ISIS as the terrorist.
Mike, you're absolutely correct. In every conversation that I've ever had with Turkish officials there in Ankara, when they talk about terrorism, they mean the Kurdistan Workers' Party, the PKK. That was established in 1978, 1984, started engaging in armed conflict against the Turkish government. It was very frustrating for the United States government officials, such as myself, to encourage them to really focus on ISIL. And they've done that much better over the past 18 months or so. But the Turkish government still sees the PKK as an existential threat, a real threat to their existence, where they don't necessarily see ISIL as an existential threat. They see it as a real challenge for them, but something that they could probably live with over the next 10 years if they had to.
You mentioned you were a U.S. government official, so I want to get you to put on that hat for us for a minute. Here's a guy at a news conference talking about commanders getting their orders from Pennsylvania, keeps hammering away at the fact that there's this cleric in Pennsylvania who's this parallel movement. They're trying to overthrow his country. If you're in the U.S. government, what position are you in right now? Because he's making these allegations, these accusations. How do you deal with it?
It's certainly an uncomfortable situation to be in. The relationship between the United States government and the president has been frosty for a very long time. It's almost as if he's sort of coming up with conspiracies to justify a purge of sorts of the upper ranks, or at least the middle ranks of his military, and looking for someone convenient to blame. And unfortunately, in Turkey and the entire region, the United States is an awfully easy scapegoat.
Peter, if I can jump in real quickly, a couple of things stand out. You talked about the frosty relationship between Washington and Erdogan. The U.S. has been trying to get him to make the border less porous, to allow militants to go back and forth. Secondly, one thing that jumps out at me, it took the administration in the United States more than 4 hours to recognize this, to weigh into it and say, let's support the democratic movement. What does that tell you about the relationship?
Yeah, no, those are excellent points. I think it was fascinating that the United States government, including the White House, along with the Department of State and Department of Defense, essentially waited on the sidelines to figure out what was going on.
Who's going to win?
Exactly, who was going to come out on top, and what we as a country, the United States, was going to do, depending on who came out on top, that is the military or the president. And so, you know, the fact that we didn't have a plan in place, or we didn't immediately come out and support, in this case, the democratically elected president of an incredibly important ally, is I think, very, very revealing. I think the United States government is going to have to redouble its efforts to try to establish a more affectionate relationship with the president. You know, in this era of supersonic jets and virtual reality and high-speed internet, geography still matters. And Syria happens to be a country that we are very, very focused on. Iran is a country that the United States is very focused on, and Iraq. And key to understanding and working with those countries is, of course, Turkey. And so Turkey is important in many ways, culturally, politically, but also its geography is incredibly essential to the United States and working with the Turkish government.
But they had to be sweating bullets at the White House, at the Pentagon, and the State Department, because Incirlik is so vital in terms of running these raids into Syria. They undoubtedly wanted this guy to prevail, because otherwise they can't really operate with a country that's been overtaken by a coup, correct?
Precisely, Mike. I mean, the U.S. government policy is that it supports democracy and it will not remain and support in a country that has a military coup. Now, the one exception of that in the recent memory is Egypt, which is, a still relevant exception. But the United States government was no doubt.
And they didn't use the word coup for a month.
For a very long time, right? Rhetoric and language matters as well. So the United States government was in a very, and remains, I think, in a very uncomfortable position because, Turkey, the second largest armed forces in NATO, with about 650,000 armed forces, an incredibly important ally, one, as you point out, that the United States depends on and uses its bases to combat ISIL on literally a daily basis. So, I wasn't obviously part of these meetings. I've been part of similar meetings, and I can tell you that sweating bullets is probably a delicate way of putting how people were feeling in the United States government.
If I can ask you one more question. You used the word that some cynics are calling it staged. Our guest previous said the same thing. Let's talk about what a dangerous game that could be. Look at where Turkey is. Look at the waterway to the north, to the east, where Russia has a great deal at stake. The oil moves in and out of the area. The bridges were controlled. I mean, this could have gotten out of hand, could have escalated rapidly and very seriously.
Absolutely, and it would have had an impact across the entire globe. What was disturbing to me with that press conference was sort of the anger and the vitriol and what I would deem a sort of lack of inspired leadership. He also seemed, when he was on that Skype or FaceTime conversation that was also quite bizarre, to be suggesting that the people should go out en masse and support him, essentially putting the people, the civilians, between the armed forces on the one hand that engaged in this attempted coup d'etat and the police forces which have remained loyal to him because he has essentially seated his own people in the police forces. So that for me is incredibly irresponsible because the ones that were going to get hurt were the innocent civilians on either side that could have literally been caught in the crossfire.
And we do know that U.S. President Barack Obama was trying to pressure Erdogan recently when he was here for that nuclear summit. You got to lighten up. I mean, there's been these human rights questions. There's been questions about freedom of the press. And yet in his news conference here, he seemed defiant and saying that actually this was a gift. It's going to be a new Turkey. It sounds like a much tougher Turkey. That has got to give pause to the White House, the State Department, and the Pentagon as well.
Mike, I have no doubt it gives a great deal of pause. I think there's great concern. Again, that relationship between the respective presidents of Turkey and the United States has not been a very affectionate one. It's been a very tense one. President Erdogan seemed to be doubling down on his strongman, on his autocratic, on an individual who seems more emboldened, in fact. And the White House is going to have to learn how to deal with that, throughout the next couple of months.
It's going to be daylight in a matter of hours. What are we going to see as daylight unfolds? Because we know there are going to be casualties. We don't know what the situation is in Ankara. We know that the president is back in Istanbul. We're still going to see pockets of this coup going on. Could it flare up again?
Absolutely. Remember, President Erdogan is not particularly popular, and he has gotten less popular over time. He's at best been at about 50%. And I think he has stoked the fires directly and intentionally to create greater tension. And again, all of our worry is that innocent individuals will get caught up in this, that when the sun comes up, we'll have greater clarity from a figurative and a literal sense, but that the bodies will show up. And then there will be this period when individuals have been able to identify their enemies, so to speak, that were on one side or another, and the flare-ups are possible for the next few weeks or next few months.
One final question before, and we're going to take a short break. I want to bring in Jack Barton in a second because he's been in Iraq. But before I do, I have to ask you this. I brought up earlier in the broadcast 1991, Gorbachev, the coup attempt there. They actually captured Gorbachev. No one captured Erdogan. It was over within a couple of days. This one was over in hours. But that was the beginning of the end for Gorbachev's rule. Do you think he's on the ropes in any sense, given that, is there anybody there in the wings at all?
Mike, it's an excellent question. I actually think he will come out of this stronger, and he will have consolidated his power. You saw the people in the streets that were evidently supporting him. He'll be able to use now a couple of different foils. He'll be able to continue to use the ever-present PKK. He'll now be able to focus even greater on ISIL because of the horrific terrorist attack that we believe ISIL committed at Ataturk Airport near Istanbul just a couple weeks ago. And he'll also be able to focus on individuals within his own country, his own military brass, so to speak. And he will deem them, and he's already started, he will tar them as traitors to the democratic country of Turkey. And so I think he will come out, unfortunately for many people, more autocratic.